In my last video, we talked about my favorite audiobook narrators. Now in this video, I'm talking about my favorite audiobook productions. So these are audiobooks where the experience of listening to it as an audiobook is my preferred method of consuming that particular story. So there's something about these types of audiobooks that enhance the story overall. So last time we just talked about narrators, and now we're going to talk about like the categories of what I think makes an excellent audiobook production, with examples, of course. My first category of audiobooks that I really enjoy listening to are audiobooks that are written in like interview style. I think books written in interview styles lend themselves really well to listening in the car or wherever via audiobook. I think especially if there's different actors for the different characters who are being interviewed. One example of an audiobook that I think is really good as an audiobook versus a physical book with this interview style is Sleeping Giants by Sylvan Neuvel. This is a adult sci-fi novel about a young woman who, when she was a child, she fell into a sinkhole and landed in a giant mechanical hand, and it's following her as an adult as she is leading the research team behind the hand. And it's like, I would classify this as a sci-fi thriller written in interview style. This novel in particular is really good as an audiobook. This is a recommendation for me, and I like lots of books like this. If they're written in interview style, I prefer them as an audiobook.
Prologue.
It was my 11th birthday. I'd gotten a new bike from my father, white and pink, with tassels on the handles. I really wanted to ride it, but my parents didn't want me to leave while my friends were there. They weren't really my friends, though. I was never really good at making friends. I liked reading, I liked walking in the woods, I liked being alone.
The second category of audiobooks are audiobooks narrated by multiple individuals for the different point of view chapters. In general, I don't prefer to read books with multiple points of view. It's just I prefer single point of view narratives. But if I do choose to pick up a book with multiple characters as point of view chapters, I prefer to listen to them via audio if there are multiple actors or actresses for the voices. For example, An Ember in the Ashes, like I was mentioning in my last video, we have Steve West, who is the male lead, and I'm forgetting her name, excuse me, a female actress for the female lead. And then we add another narrator for the additional voice in the subsequent novels. And to me, that just enhances the experience of switching points of view. I think the reason I don't prefer different points of view type narratives is because I feel kind of jarred. You know, I feel kind of tossed and turned about going back and forth between the different characters when I want to stay with one character if I care about them more. But I think this style of audiobook helps me to enjoy the story more. Another example that is probably my favorite audiobook in this style, excuse the dog, is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I talked about this in my last video. The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo has two narrators, one for Evelyn and one for the journalist, and of course Robin Miles is one of the narrators, so I already love it. But I think separating the story of Evelyn and her history from the framing narrative works really well with two narrators, in my opinion.
Can you come into my office? I look around at the desks beside me, and then back at Frankie, trying to confirm to whom exactly she's talking. I point to myself. Do you mean me? Frankie has very little patience. Yes, Monique, you. That's why I said, Monique, can you come into my office? Sorry, I just heard the last part. Frankie turns, I grab my notepad and follow her.
Third category I have are comedies. I think listening to books that are funny via audio enhances the experience for me. And the example I have for this is maybe obvious, but it's The Martian by Andy Weir. This is hilarious. Hilarious. And I remember actually reading this book physically and not enjoying, having a good time with it, but then I listened to it again via audio, and I just remember having way more fun listening to the voice of Mark Watney as, you know, narrated by Will Wheaton than I did imagining his voice in my head as I was physically reading. You know what I mean? At least that's, for me, that was my experience reading this book. Another example I have is actually My Lady Jane. This is a young adult historical fantasy, and this is hilarious. I was reading this via audio, and again, I was laughing out loud, thinking this was the funniest thing ever, and just really enjoying hearing the jokes versus reading them. So I don't think it works for every single book, you know, hearing a joke versus reading it and imagining it in your own head, but for me, these two books really worked for that comedic factor.
Chapter 1. Log Entry. Soul 6. I'm pretty much fucked. That's my considered opinion. Fucked. 6 days into what should be the greatest 2 months of my life, and it's turned into a nightmare. I don't even know who'll read this. I guess someone will find it eventually, maybe 100 years from now. For the record, I didn't die on Soul 6. Certainly the rest of the crew thought I did, and I can't blame them. Maybe there'll be a day of national mourning for me, and my Wikipedia page will say, Mark Watney is the only human being to have died on Mars.
My fourth category of audiobooks are when authors narrate their own, specifically their own memoirs. So I love it when I get to hear the author tell their own story that they have written. Obviously, the biggest example is Becoming, written and narrated by Michelle Obama. I have a copy, but I don't want to pull it out. I think Michelle Obama's voice was already, I already loved her voice when she was First Lady, but hearing her tell her own story was incredibly moving and at times heartbreaking and hopeful, and just really played with my emotions. I think she does a fantastic job narrating and performing her own novel. Some other examples include Know My Name, written and narrated by Chanel Miller, who was a rape victim, rape survivor, and it's the story of her struggle and the trial and her emotional trauma. Again, a really harrowing, really hard book to listen to, but I think Chanel not only she writes beautifully, and she did such a good job of not emoting just the right amount of emotion as she narrated. When things were tough, she conveyed that with her voice, but when things were hopeful, she also conveyed that with her voice, and I was just really swept away by her words and her voice as I was listening to this. And my last example is In the Dream House by Carmen Marie Machado, which is the story of Carmen and her ex-girlfriend, and it was a toxic relationship, and the story, or the memoir, is framed in this the theme of a haunted house. So fantastic theme, really interesting concept, so well written, and again, in Carmen Marie Machado's own voice, this story really swept me away, and I was entranced. I could not put this down. I listened to it in one sitting. So those are just some examples of memoirs read by their authors that I think far surpass the physical reading experience.
Becoming. Preface. March 2017. When I was a kid, my aspirations were simple. I wanted a dog. I wanted a house that had stairs in it, 2 floors for one family. I wanted, for some reason, a 4-door station wagon instead of the 2-door Buick that was my father's pride and joy.
The last category I have is a little hard to pin down, but it's hard-hitting books with child characters that are really emotionally gut-punching. I've talked about this in past videos about how those are some of my favorite books of all time are stories about breaking naivete with children and, you know, growing up. And that's a tough subject because we all grow up. I mean, I hope we all grow up to be adults from children. And so reading about children growing up and going through these hard things as an adult is so emotionally impactful, and it's some of my favorite audiobooks to listen to because it just hits me 10 times harder. One example I have is Pet by Ekwege Emezi. Jam is 16, the main character. However, it's written as if it's kind of aged lower, in my opinion, in the writing. And this was an emotional gut punch, and again, the narration added to that emotional punch and made me cry. And the biggest example I want to call out, because I have a little bit of a story behind it, is A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, narrated by Jason Isaacs. The story I have with this one is basically, okay, so the summary of this book is that the main character, Connor, his mother is dying of cancer. And a monster starts to visit him at night and tells him stories that are really hard to hear. And this book, I remember I was listening to it in the car on my way to work. And I remember finishing it about halfway through my drive to work, and I was sobbing, uncontrollably sobbing, listening to the last few chapters of this book. It was so raw and so meaty and beautiful and harrowing and just hard to listen to. I just remember crying, like I had to sit in my car for like 15 minutes and like collect myself before I could walk into my building because I was just so emotional listening to this book. This book is also illustrated, so like the reading experience of it is also really beautiful. But for me, listening to this story being told to me, especially because it has a storytelling element in it, the monster is telling Connor stories. It was just a beautiful representation and interpretation of the work.
A Monster Calls. The monster showed up just after midnight, as they do. Connor was awake when it came. He'd had a nightmare. Well, not a nightmare, the nightmare. The one he'd been having a lot lately. The one with the darkness and the wind and the screaming. The one with the hands slipping from his grasp, no matter how hard he tried to hold on.
Those are my favorite types of audiobook production, my favorite audiobooks in general. What enhances a reading experience for you? Is it audiobooks? Is it specific types of audiobooks? Is it mood? Do you like music in your audiobooks? I'm a little on the fence about that one, but let me know all your thoughts about audiobooks in the comments down below, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!